Hello, and welcome to the Boston Globe's annual Sustainability Week. My name is Sabrina Shankman, and I report on climate change here at the Boston Globe. I am delighted to be joined today by Jennifer Granholm, our U.S. Energy Secretary, in a position she has held since 2021. Welcome.
Thanks so much, Sabrina. Glad to be on with you.
Yeah. Secretary Granholm's tenure has been defined by the Biden administration's goal of getting to net zero carbon emissions by 2050, which requires a massive transition in the way we heat our homes, power our cars, and create electricity. So let's start off by talking about where you see the biggest progress so far and where the most work remains.
Oh my gosh, Sabrina, it is so astonishing what we are seeing across the country in terms of the response and the really what the the three laws, right, that everybody talks about, the Inflation Reduction Act, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, and the CHIPS and Science Act. Those three comprise the Biden administration's Invest in America agenda. And for those of us who are policy wonks, how gratifying to know that policy actually works, because what we're seeing is just amazing investment in America in clean energy technologies, the bringing back, the reshoring to America of manufacturing jobs, which is, I mean, I'm a former governor of Michigan, and I know that Massachusetts had experienced a lot of loss of jobs, in the earlier part of this century, because we stood by as a nation and just folded our hands and watched as all these jobs went away. And that is just not happening anymore. I mean, America has become the irresistible nation for the building of these projects, the products, and the installation of them so that we're generating clean energy. So it is, I mean, huge promise, huge activity that has happened over the past 3 years. And, I think when you ask about the challenges, I would say that, we're still, there's some fits and starts with respect to some of the technologies. Offshore wind has had a bit of a fit and start. The electric vehicle industry didn't move as fast at the beginning part of this year as some were expecting, but a lot of that has to do with sort of glitches in either the supply chain or glitches in the infrastructure. And that's all going to smooth out as the infrastructure is built. And so I am extremely bullish on these laws doing the job that they were set out to do, which is to reduce greenhouse gas pollution and to make sure that we are the nation that is leading the world in addressing climate change.
Yeah. Well, we're going to drill into several of those things that you just mentioned. But first, what I wanted to ask is, one thing that we have seen historically is that when the presidency changes hands, the pendulum can swing pretty quickly. Who can forget President Trump leaving the Paris Agreement on day one of his presidency, and then President Biden rejoining on day one of his presidency? So, understanding you can't speak to the election due to the Hatch Act, wondering if you can speak to what has happened during the Biden administration that is durable? What will last? And also what's at risk?
Well, this is such an important question because, first of all, the way these laws were constructed were to be durable. So the tax credits are last for 10 years. It is hard to imagine that factories going into districts, whether they're blue or they're red districts, once they are in a community and people have been hired, it would be political malpractice for somebody to say, oh no, we're not going to support this. And if you did that, what would that say? If you were a legislator who said, we're going to undo this, what does that mean? That you want to ship these jobs offshore, that you want to take away jobs from people, that you don't want to be manufacturing in America? So politically, it would be, even though there's a lot of this, the fact is that 60% of these investments have been going into red districts. And, so bottom line is it would be very difficult to undo, not to mention legally. I think it would be difficult to undo because, of course, a lot of these companies are acting in reliance upon the bills that have been passed. So to undo it would be very difficult. And I also think it just would be it would be impossible for politically for somebody to get reelected if they're taking people's jobs away in their district.
Well, but we in Massachusetts understand very much how projects can be slowed down depending on
Mhm,
the whims of an
mhm.
administration. Obviously, Vineyard
That's
Wind,
true.
right, would have been realized far sooner. It is now bringing electricity to the grid, but that took a lot longer than it had been anticipated to due to some delays. So, I mean, so let's speak a little bit to that reality because that reality is there.
Well, I mean, there is the reality of delay because of just permitting delays or infrastructure delays or supply chain delays or workforce delays. There's that kind of delay, which, happens in projects all over the place. And then there's the kind of delay that would be an intentional delay so that you are actually slowing the hiring of people or the building of a project. And again, that too, I mean, people have their eyes open, those voters, those people who live in those communities. It just is hard to imagine something being completely unearthed once it has begun. And this is why the movement of all of these companies has been very fast, because they do want to get steel in the ground. I mean, they want to benefit from the tax credits for as long as they exist. So there's an incentive to get your project up and running, particularly if it's a production tax credit. You want to make sure that you're taking advantage of the tax credits for as long as possible. It's true, I mean, the Inflation Reduction Act is largely about tax credits, and the bipartisan infrastructure law is largely about grants. Again, that's a broad statement, but the grants we have launched first and foremost, the Department of Energy got about $100 billion from both of those to put out the door. And we have launched 100% of these programs in one way or another. That doesn't mean 100% of the money has gone out the door yet, but it means that the programs have been launched, that we're in the middle of selections, and we're going to get as many of this complete as possible so that it is clear people have their promises in hand or their funding in hand and their projects have begun. And all of this speaks not just to the political expediency of anything. It's really about we're living in a world where we are in a climate crisis and we want to move quickly on this regardless. So there's a deep sense of urgency here at the department and in this administration to get these funds out the door.
Yeah. So one area that you talked about before was electric vehicles. And I think it's really interesting because depending on what day you pick up any newspaper, you might get a very different impression about how it's going for EVs these days. Like either they're doomed and they're way behind and nobody wants them and there's no infrastructure for charging, or sales are soaring ahead of what we expected and the market is picking up and starting to compete with, European sales. So can you cut through some of that and talk to me about, where are we on this transition to electric vehicles? And also like where we do need to speed up, what has to happen in order for
Yeah.
that to go
Yeah, I
ahead?
mean, this is an example of the holistic strategy that the Biden administration has brought to these technologies. So when I say holistic, it's not just about people buying electric vehicles, it's also about making them in the United States. It's also about incentivizing people to buy those vehicles. It's also about incentivizing those vehicle makers to locate in the United States. It's also about the full supply chain, meaning the batteries for the electric vehicles and the guts to those batteries, which might be critical minerals. We got to have that whole supply chain in the United States. It's also about taking away range anxiety for people, which means building out the charging infrastructure across the country. All of those pieces are embodied in the president's Invest in America agenda. So right now, we saw, for example, in 2023, we saw a 50% increase in the sales of electric vehicles. So almost 10%, just shy of 10%, 1.4 million electric vehicles sold, which was 50% higher than the year before. In 2024, we project it'll probably be about 1.8 million electric vehicles sold. So still a very significant increase. I mean, year over year, if you get a 30% increase, that's a pretty good increase and a pretty good indicator. And what we're doing to be able to address some of the two big anxieties that people have are cost and range, right? Range meaning, do I have a charging station? Or range meaning, will my battery take me long enough so that I can recharge at home if I have a garage and a plug? So on the charging infrastructure, there was $7.5 billion in the president's agenda to build out that charging infrastructure across the United States. All of that funding for these first two rounds have gone to the states. They are in the planning processes. Some of them have begun actually putting steel in the ground, but the goal is to get 500,000 charging stations across the country, particularly for the public money in the places where the private sector isn't going. So in long distance corridors, transportation corridors, or in rural areas where people aren't buying electric vehicles. It's not something that they've done. Getting that charging station in will reduce the opposition to doing that, or in urban areas where it might be difficult to charge. So we want to address that, and that is starting. At the same time, we want to incentivize the uptake in electric vehicles. So $7,500 off the top for buying a new electric vehicle if it's made in the United States, 7,500 or 7,500 off of a lease. And that fully doesn't have to be even made in the United States. And on top of that, Massachusetts, I think, has a $3,500 tax credit again that you can take. So that now you're talking about $11,000 off the prices of a car. In addition to that, by volume, because all these batteries are now being built, the price of the battery has come down for electric vehicles, and that is reducing the price of the vehicle as well. So many EVs, electric vehicles, and internal combustion engine gas-powered vehicles are on par right now in terms of pricing. So that takes away another barrier. So the bottom line is we're working on all of these pieces at once to really create a thriving electric vehicle industry in the United States and create all those jobs that go with it.
It's fascinating how connected everything is. I was talking to someone in a rural part of Massachusetts who's working to try and bring more green energy infrastructure to his town some months ago, and he was telling me how they, were really interested in having chargers at their town offices, but they couldn't. Well, they had installed them, but they couldn't actually connect them to the grid because they needed an infrastructure upgrade. But they're so low on the list because there are so many other upgrades needed that the utilities are trying to get to, that they were looking at years out from being able to actually power up the chargers that people would be able to use in his rural corner of the state. And it was enlightening to me to realize just how many layers of challenges there are. I mean, what would you say to that, town manager there?
Well, I mean, first of all, the funding that is coming through the Department of Energy is to the states, and the states all had to submit a plan of how they were going to address charging in those rural areas and in those transportation corridors. Now, I don't know that specific area, but clearly you have to bring along the utilities with you because you've got to have enough power to be able to do the charging. And that's why the conversations with utilities is another piece of the plan. So, for example, we're through the grant program, these grid resilience and grid innovation partnership grants to be able to get more power onto the grid, clean power, to be able to do the charging for electric vehicles, as well as for the additional power needs that are coming online because of AI, for example, and these additional data centers that are going to be sucking a lot of the energy up. And we can have a whole conversation on that. But the bottom line is we have to do everything everywhere all at once. And you're right, it's all connected.
Right. All right. So switching gears a little bit. In the energy space, there are often claims that appear green, but actually look more like greenwashing. So technologies that may just allow fossil fuel companies to perpetuate their way of business into the future without actually slashing emissions. Advocates and experts say it's particularly true when it comes to certain technologies like carbon capture and sequestration or hydrogen and some of the certain proposed applications of those technologies. To what extent are you concerned about greenwashing when you're thinking about investments that the administration is making?
Yeah, I mean, we've identified, and in the laws, there are specific targeted grants for companies to do a suite of interventions on the planet to remove greenhouse gas emissions. And the carbon capture, carbon dioxide removal, clean hydrogen, if it's clean, right, are all a piece of the big puzzle. And it's because, for example, the scientists and the investigators that are associated with the Paris Accords, that with COP, have identified that we just can't get to net zero by 2050 without removing CO2, without removing carbon pollution. And some of these technologies, some of these fuels are fuels that we can't live with and we can't live without. So, for example, the CO2 that's produced because we use plastics, et cetera, or cement, et cetera, those are heavy, intensive CO2 producing industries. And we've got to reduce that. We got to be more efficient, but we also have to remove the CO2 from the atmosphere as well. And so it is, that's one piece of the puzzle, but there's also the other piece about generating clean. And on hydrogen, as an example, the part of the President's Invest in America agenda has identified 7 hydrogen hubs, clean hydrogen hubs across the country. And some of them have different fuel stocks, if you will, different feedstocks. Some of it is renewable energy that creates hydrogen by splitting water using an electrolyzer. Some of it is natural gas that has the CO2 removed and the methane leaks plugged up. They're all different. And part of this is, we're seen across the globe as a leader in these technologies. And we're learning too as we go. We will make sure that we are acting in a way that really does remove CO2 and reduce CO2 pollution. But it'll be very interesting to see from us as well as our partners around the globe, which actually works best so that we aren't in fact subsidizing something that creates a bigger problem than what existed in previously. I don't know, some of it, you just have to be eyes wide open to make sure that you're funding the right projects with the right intent and with the right outcomes, most importantly.
Yeah, it's just interesting because I think back to, 15, 20 years ago and thinking about natural gas as the clean bridge
Yeah,
to the future. And there was not a conversation about, oh, this is actually mostly methane. And we rely,
all
especially in
methane.
Florida, on
Yeah,
a leaky
essentially.
system,
Yep.
right?
Yep. Yeah. I mean, this is another reason why it's so important. I mean, the Biden administration has both carrots and sticks in the whole overarching strategy. And one of the players is the EPA. And the EPA has some sticks like a methane fee. And we are really excited about what we're seeing from a technology perspective about detecting methane and being able to plug up methane leaks. Of course, methane being a super potent greenhouse gas emitting emitter. So we want to make sure that we plug up the emissions, and there's technology to do that. There's technology to detect, and there's fines for not plugging up your methane leaks. So all of that is a piece of the strategy as well.
Yeah. Um, so one thing I wanted to raise is we are in this moment of duality right now in the United States. The US is the largest producer of crude globally, and President Biden's approval of oil drilling permits has outstripped the record of President Trump even. At the same time, this is an administration that has enacted historic climate and clean energy legislation and taken all these steps that we've just been discussing. How do you reconcile those two things?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, we remember why the president called upon the oil and gas industry for more production was because Putin invaded Ukraine and pulled a whole slew of oil, in particular, off of the global market, because of course oil is traded globally. And so we wanted to make sure that that didn't impact people. It's very regressive what people have to pay for gasoline, right? And so he wanted to make sure the costs for real people were not borne borne by everyday citizens because of Putin's war. At the same time, it is a duality, because at the same time, we are completely accelerating this movement to clean. We know it's a transition. We know you can't just stop all fossil fuel production and have people stop driving their cars, et cetera. That's just not realistic. So that's why the goal is to get to net zero by 2050. And the president has a goal of getting to 100% clean electricity by 2035. And those are our, in the Department of Energy, those are our big, hairy, audacious goals, is how are we making sure we're deploying the technology that gets us to those two goals. We understand you got to keep the lights on. And while you keep the lights on, you still want to accelerate the building out of this clean energy future. And that is the managing of that transition, and that balance is going to go forward between now and 2050. But hopefully we get to clean as soon as possible so that we have no more, or at least very little, polluting of the atmosphere, so that we can stop particularly these extreme weather events from happening.
Right. But I mean, when it comes to a piece of infrastructure or a drilling permit or whatever it may be being approved to solve a short-term problem or an immediate problem, I mean, it's interesting because that infrastructure is often expected to have a certain lifespan, generally 30 years, 50 years, something like that, taking us well past 2050 at this point. So I mean, how do you weigh those decisions? And like if when the next thing happens, because something's always happening in global politics, as we see, that could drive really a really detrimental effect have a really detrimental effect on the oil markets. Like, is that I don't know, how do you address that? How do you avoid continuing to greenlight infrastructure that will exist for decades to come?
So, I mean, a couple of quick responses on this. One, it's one of the reasons why we are working with our allies around the world to accelerate their transition to green, so that these global fuels like liquefied natural gas or oil. We want to make sure that we are reducing the globe's reliance on those technologies, so that there doesn't have to be permanent infrastructure built, or stranded assets, as they say, built, that will last well into the future. This is one of the things that we're looking at. I mean, the Biden administration announced a pause in approving new authorization for liquefied natural gas amounts. And so that is to review what the market looks like globally, what the impacts of GHG will be because of approving additional liquefied natural gas terminals and exports, what the impacts are at home. If we are exporting all this liquefied natural gas, what does it do to our own prices for people who use natural gas, including the business community who uses natural gas at home? And what is the impact on national security from a global security point of view? What if you have more action that is Putin-like around the world, and you have our allies in Europe without any fuel? So all of those things are being evaluated by our national labs right now to be able to study this very question, because it has to be done thoughtfully, but with the notion that the goal is to get to net zero by 2050 and 100% clean by 2035.
Okay. So at this point, I'm going to shift gears a little bit. We got several questions that were submitted for you from people as they were registering for Sustainability Week, and I want to make sure I get some time to ask those. The first one that came through is: has the United States thought of imposing a carbon tax?
Yeah, I would say, we're leading the most ambitious climate agenda in history, and that includes these historic investments through the Inflation Reduction Act, et cetera. At the same time, we're taking all this executive action to, cut carbon pollution across every sector. We're seeing how that goes. It has not been at the top of the president's agenda to do a carbon tax. He wants to do the carrot side and really invest in making America irresistible for clean energy deployment and for clean energy product building. And so that's where his head is at the moment. But he understands the efficiency, I'll say, of a carbon tax from a conceptual point of view. It's just not been where he's at.
Okay. I like the idea of making America irresistible again. Okay, the next question that came through I really like, because I love thinking about like I don't know, these like long shot energy solutions that probably won't work, but like what if they did? And so this person was asking if you could talk about ARPA-E, so the Advanced Research Projects Agency that's tasked with promoting and funding research and development of advanced energy tech. They didn't say anything specific beyond that, but maybe you could just talk about some of the interesting work being done over there.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, DOE has a whole cascade of offices, from early stage sort of research development. We have 17 national labs. They do all the basic science. They do the research. They do early stage development, and then it kind of jumps to, what about people who've actually have a great idea and they're taking it from lab to the street, maybe risky. That's where ARPA-E fits in, because they fund those early stage, more risky concepts. So whether it's, electric aviation, taxis from the air, or whether it's, the ability to be able to underground wires through underground transmission wires to be resilient through something called gopher. They have all sorts of super interesting things. And in fact, for anybody who's interested, there's an ARPA-E summit every year where about 3,000 people come from 49 states, 27 countries to see these advancements in clean technology. And this year it's going to be in Dallas, Texas, by the way, from May, I'll put in a plug, May 22nd to 24th. And there's a bunch of great speakers, et cetera. But then you can go and see what the showcase is of all of these very cool clean energy technologies. And just to jump from that quickly, we also have a program which has what we call, instead of moonshots, we call them earth shots. And those earth shots are focused on the latest, on really bringing down the cost of clean energy technologies like offshore floating wind platforms. We want to reduce by 70% the cost of those platforms so that it becomes easy to do offshore wind, or reducing the cost of clean hydrogen to $1 for 1 kilogram within 1 decade, or reducing the cost of long duration energy storage by 90%. So all of those earth shots are happening at the same time, and that involves people from the labs, from ARPA-E, from our program offices, from our deployment offices. So it's a whole spectrum of investments in next generation technologies, making current technologies more efficient, and making sure the basic technologies for clean energy are deployed.
Um, Everything that you just said was interesting, but you said something about taxis in the air, and I'm very curious. Can
Electric
you just tell me
taxis
what you
in the
mean?
air. Come on.
Are we
That's
talking
something.
about flying taxis in cities? What are we talking about here?
Yes, yes. I mean, it may not have wheels on it in the same way, but they're like small, kind of maybe like it doesn't even have to be a helicopter, might be something that has the ability to do a vertical, pickup and landing. But yeah, that's in your future.
I am delighted by this, and it was unexpected. It feels very Jetsons-y, but
It is
wonderful.
very Jetsons.
um, Okay, great. So next question that came through is actually relevant to something I've written recently about what efforts are being made at the federal level to counteract misinformation and opposition to renewable energy projects. I recently wrote a story about some of the misinformation specifically around whale deaths and offshore
Yes.
wind, which
First of
is
all,
just,
thank you
yeah,
for putting it out there. And there's studies being done all the time to continue to counteract this astroturfing, or what the version of it is, that is being done by people who simply oppose offshore wind, not because it's unsightly or whatever, but because their interests. They don't want to see electrification of anything. They'd rather see fossil fuel usage. So some have focused on whale deaths as a result of wind turbines, which, as you know, is false. And we've developed at the Department of Energy Malarkey Corner on our website to sort of combat some of this nonsense that's out there. I mean, there's a variety of different urban legends or non-urban legends that go along with energy, but we really appreciate the truth tellers coming from the media to be able to clarify for people what is true and what is not true. So if anybody's interested, go to our Malarkey Corner on our website at energy.gov, and you can see good ways to counteract some of that misinformation.
the thing that I find so interesting about it is, there has been this research that has helped show some of the connection between think tanks or special interests that are more interested in fossil fuel and putting out the message around this. But a lot of the people who care deeply about whales are receiving this information and they're sharing it
Yeah.
with very good intent in their hearts. They're being told that a creature that they care deeply about, especially in Massachusetts as a coastal state with North Atlantic right whales right in our backyard. It comes from this very, very good place, and they feel very attached to this concept that has been making the rounds so prominently. And so, I mean, it is funny, Malarkey Corner. That I get it, but also they're like, how do you? I don't know. How do you get in there when someone has so deeply identified with an idea, even if it was planted with nefarious reasons, it has become their own. I mean, I don't know, what can the federal government do to help counteract that?
I mean, I wish I had the answer to how to counteract misinformation where honestly well-intending people receive it from sources they believe are legit and then take it and move with it. And we see that not just in energy, obviously, but we're seeing it across the spectrum. This is, it's something for all Americans to really do their homework on when they hear tales like this. But it's why, again, I'm grateful to media members who, like you, who are willing to put out the facts. It is difficult. I think there's going to have to be a more coordinated pushback by some of the NGOs, perhaps, and pushing the right messages out so that people see that perhaps that they are being misled by folks who have vested interest in the status quo. And so we all have our work to do.
Yeah. All right. Well, there's one other question that came through, and then I will let you go. But so this last question changes gears again. But they note that in their view, reducing solid waste is an attainable way to swiftly bring down our carbon footprint. And they wonder, can composting organics be done at scale in Massachusetts and in the United States more broadly? And how can we build support for this?
Yeah, we have a biofuels technology office that is focused on the whole spectrum of how we deal with waste, biological waste, municipal solid waste, and how, in many cases, that waste, of course, can be turned into biofuels and can be turned into biofuels in a way that doesn't create greenhouse gas emissions like we have seen in the past. Can composting be done at scale? Sure, it can be. But it has to be at scale, and that takes a lot of infrastructure to be able to do that in cities, in states, but totally encourage that and encourage you know, we're very interested in a circular economy, so we're interested in all ways that we can return bio waste to the soil and have that perpetuate, a virtuous cycle. That's true in bio waste, it's true in batteries, it's true in wind turbine blades, it's true in a whole range of technologies, products, and waste. Municipal solid waste is high on the list. That can be converted to, for example, sustainable aviation fuel, which is part of we have a sustainable aviation fuel grand challenge. That's municipal solid waste, but that's also bio waste. So there's all sorts of ways to be able to take waste and convert it to something useful in a virtuous cycle.
All right. Well, I'm sorry to say that is all the time that we have today, but thank you so much, Secretary Granholm, for making the time for this.
You bet. It was delightful to be
It
with
really
you.
was.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Yeah, and to those of you who tuned in, thanks so much for joining us. I hope you'll check out the other great Sustainability Week events this week, and that you'll follow along with our climate reporting at the Boston Globe.